Terrorist assault on America. 2 hijacked planes crash into the Twin Towers of New York's World Trade Center. Presumably packed with office workers, the planes full of passengers. No one knows the scale of the carnage. Both landmark towers have collapsed. Lower Manhattan is evacuated, New York as never before. And a 3rd hijacked airliner hits the Pentagon in Washington, epicenter of America's defense. A 4th crashes in Pennsylvania. Good evening. Terrorists have struck at the financial and military heart of the world's superpower. The global financial capital of New York is at a standstill. The federal government has shut down. All its offices in Washington have been evacuated. The president has been flown to a military base for safety, well away from the capital. 4 passenger airliners were hijacked in the operation tonight. The moments of panic as fire engulfed the World Trade Center's towers. The scene on the ground as New Yorkers fled the collapsing buildings. In Washington, the very Pentagon itself under attack, the White House evacuated. As smoke billows around the nation's capital, who did it? And what can President Bush do now?
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
An unknown number of casualties in an atrocity beyond anyone's comprehension. Tonight, America is a country sealed off from the rest of the world, with all international flights grounded, all land borders closed. The 4 attacks were launched with frightening speed first thing this morning. Just before 9 a.m. New York time, a hijacked jet smashed into one of the twin trade towers in New York's Lower Manhattan. At 9:18, millions watching television pictures of the first blaze saw another plane crash into the 2nd tower. As panic spread throughout New York, another hijacked plane slammed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., home to the Department of Defense. Then a car bomb exploded at the Department of State. A hijacked American Airlines jumbo jet from New York to San Francisco also crashed near Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. The World Trade Center was at the heart of New York's financial district. 50,000 people worked there every day. At 7 minutes past 10 New York time, the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed. 20 minutes later, it was followed by the North Tower. The cost in terms of human life is impossible to calculate. President Bush vowed to hunt down those behind the attacks. He said, "Terrorism against our nation will not stand." World leaders from Tony Blair to Yasser Arafat have expressed their outrage. Lindsay Taylor now reports.
At first, no one can believe it, but it's all too real. The World Trade Center in flames, smoke spewing from the upper floors. A gaping hole in one of the center's 2 110-story towers. It's been caused by an aircraft crashing straight into it. It seems initially as though there's been a terrible accident. But as the American TV networks struggle to make sense of what their helicopter camera crews and eyewitnesses are depicting, senses are suddenly challenged beyond imagination from the right of the picture.
I'd say the whole takes about, looks like 6, 7 floors were taken out. And there's more explosions right now. Hold on, people are running.
Wait, hold on just a moment. We've got an explosion inside.
The building's exploding right now. You got people running up the street.
Okay.
Hold on, I'll tell you what's going on.
Okay, just put Winston on pause there for just a moment.
Okay, the whole building just exploded some more. The whole top part.
Okay.
The building's still intact. People are running up the streets. Am I still connected?
It happened so fast it was at first unnoticed, but before the world's eyes, a second plane has ploughed directly into the centre's other tower. With such images come a sickening dawning. One such plane crash might have been an accident. 2 must be deliberate. One of the USA's greatest institutions has been deliberately targeted. America is under attack. As we're fixated by the images of the burning buildings, it's impossible to imagine what is happening inside. 2 relatively large passenger jets disappear inside the huge structures. The casualties must be enormous. Both planes were passenger aircraft and were full of people. Then images that will haunt for years to come. On some of the floors, survivors of the initial impacts appear at the windows. Their exits blocked by the destruction and carnage inside. All they can do is signal for help. They can see and smell freedom, but no one can reach them hundreds of feet up. With events to come, it's unlikely any of these people will survive. Around this time, President Bush vows to hunt down those responsible for the atrocity. But even as he speaks, it emerges that the US Capitol has also been hit. The Pentagon in Washington, nerve center of the US military, struck by another crashed passenger aeroplane. US establishments had increased security since the World Trade Center bombing in 1993, but it wasn't enough to prevent this. A series of blatant and seemingly unstoppable attacks. The FBI had been investigating a series of hijacks today, but by then the planes were already close to completing their deadly missions. This is the worst nightmare for the US security establishment, a strike at the heart of government and the people. But back in New York, it's not over. The first of the Trade Center towers collapses like a house of cards. Gone are the hopes of escape of those who survived the initial impact. Hundreds of tons of masonry falling to the ground where emergency service workers, onlookers and others have been trying to help.
Everything just went black. Everything came down, glass started popping. People got hurt, stuff went on top of them. And it was a big explosion. Everything got dark, real dark, like snow. You can see behind me, oh, this is not snow, this is all from the building. It was a terrible nightmare.
Then the second nightmare. If there was panic before, it's now out of control, as an already appalling situation gets worse and worse. At a stroke, the streets of the most powerful and well-defended nation in the world are filled with fear. It's still not known who carried out such attacks or what motivation there could be for crashing planes full of civilians into skyscrapers full of people going about their lives. It's estimated the numbers of dead will run into tens of thousands, but no one yet really knows. No one can take in the enormity of what has happened. No one has the experience of dealing with death and destruction on this sort of scale. No one knows why it happened, and no one knows quite how America will respond.
Lindsay Taylor reporting. It is a war zone, chaos everywhere, people crying and screaming. New Yorkers describing the sheer panic at the horror wreaked upon their city. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani said a horrendous number of lives had been lost. Hospitals in the city are said to be choked with casualties short of blood, queues of people waiting to give it. Krishnan Gurumurthy reports now on the day's terrible events in New York City.
On the ground, just after 9 o'clock, the people of Manhattan still had no idea of either what exactly had happened or what was about to happen.
Move it! Come on!
At this stage, 2 aircraft had crashed into the World Trade Center towers, but nobody imagined they could actually collapse.
So I was right there. I was down in the basement, came down, all of a sudden the elevator blew up, smoke. I dragged the guy out, his skin was hanging off.
I was just standing here watching the World Trade Center after the first plane hit. I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the south tower halfway between the bottom and the top of the tower. It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
Office workers streamed out of the area, traumatized, many with no idea what had happened to their colleagues.
And we heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know. And I don't know, everybody just doesn't know where to go. They won't let, everything is blocked off. You can't even, they're telling us to get out, but there's nowhere to go.
Then the unimaginable. Police, fire and ambulance workers all caught together with those still trying to leave the area as one tower collapsed, spraying tons of concrete, metal and other debris hundreds of yards.
Back!
Need some water.
Here. Get the cameras out of here, let's go! Get off now, go!
With no idea how many new casualties they were leaving behind, many rescuers simply had to run for their lives, as did those trying to cover the unfolding scene.
All the people traffic was running up. And I'm looking up, I'm trying to call the station, trying to find where we are. And I look up and the tower just starts crumbling down. And everybody in the street just stops and started crying and bawling. And I'm standing next to a fireman, he said, yeah, they just bombed the Pentagon too.
The immense scale of this attack was becoming clear to the watching world. But down on the ground, with phone and power out, coordinating the response was already near impossible. Evacuating the complex web of densely packed buildings, painfully chaotic.
We tried to do a floor-by-floor search. New York City Police, the Fire Department, Port Authority Police, best they could, tried to get everybody out. But as you know, there were people still coming out after that building came down.
Do you have any idea how many people would normally be in the building at 8:30 or north? This is the director of the World Trade Center.
There are probably 10,000 people in each tower. 10,000 people in each tower would typically be in there on a normal business day. And we get about another 5,000 visitors during the course of the entire day. So by 8:30, 9 o'clock, the building should have been full.
New York's emergency services were overwhelmed. Even now, there is frankly no idea of how many casualties there will have been or how many dead. It was Election Day in New York. The mayor, Rudy Giuliani, suspended them and advised New Yorkers to stay calm.
To see what happened there is, of course, it makes you very, very angry.
Uptown, in an amazingly unscathed Times Square, the city watched in horror on the big screens.
I've never had a feeling in the city like this. Everybody is like frozen. I mean, this is like, if they can do this, what's next?
He has perhaps articulated the fears tonight of America.
No!
Krishnan and Guru Murthy reporting this catastrophe has left the whole of America in shock and on high alert. One leading senator said it was the second Pearl Harbor, just as devastating a blow to America's security and national pride. Mark Easton reports now on a day which has wrought terror on the world's superpower.
The Pentagon, symbol of America's military might, powerless to defend against this coordinated terrorist assault on the United States. A hijacked plane was crashed deliberately into the building within an hour of the World Trade Center crashes in New York. The explosion caused extensive physical damage to the Defense Department. 5 floors collapsed as firefighters tried to restrain the fierce blaze which raged through one side of the building. The impact was on the Army section of the Pentagon, where some of the US's most senior officers would have been working. Billows of smoke drifted over the Potomac River towards the US capital, Washington, the most powerful city on the planet, now in panic.
I'm actually astonished, I'm scared to death, and I'm praying for all of us.
This had to happen. As long as we're going to let people off the hook in the Mideast, Iraq, Iran, and places like that, when they blow up buildings in Beirut and places like that, if we don't take a strong stand, this is going to continue.
Before the full scale of the attack was known, President Bush, on a visit to Florida, made it clear he wanted revenge.
I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
The government of the USA effectively came to a halt as thousands of workers were moved out of strategic buildings. The Departments of Justice and State, the Treasury Building, the Capitol Building, the CIA headquarters and the White House were evacuated. The Pentagon, too, was partially evacuated, although its very design was created to withstand an attack just like this. Command and control functions can be moved to another section within the Defense Department. This evening it was announced that the USA is now on a war footing. President Bush has cancelled plans to return to Washington and has been flown aboard Air Force One to the safety of a military base in Louisiana.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks.
The US Secretary of State, Colin Powell, currently in Peru, has been in constant touch with the president.
They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy. They cannot destroy our society. They cannot destroy our belief in the democratic way.
It wasn't just New York and Washington which were targeted. 2 United airliners carrying a total of 110 passengers also crashed, one outside Pittsburgh, the other in a location not immediately identified. The terrorist attacks have crippled the infrastructure of the entire nation. The air traffic control system's been shut down. All airports in the US and Canada have been closed. This evening, orders came through for all US land borders to be blocked. The Wall Street stock market's been suspended. Strategic buildings across the continent have been evacuated, and millions of phone lines on the East Coast have been crippled. Tonight, America is in shock. Panic fills the air. Thousands are dead. Millions must mourn. In the history of the United States, there has hardly been a day as black.
Mark Easton. James Rubin, President Clinton's Assistant Secretary of State, is in West London. General Sir Michael Rose, who commanded the UN Protection Force in Bosnia, is in Bristol. Professor Paul Rogers, a terrorism expert, is in Leeds. James Rubin, I want to take you to the office that you occupied, the State Department. It's evacuated. Every single one of your colleagues has been evacuated. This is something unimaginable.
Well, it really is. I think all of us who served in government understood that Washington was always, in a sense, a target. We took certain steps to protect ourselves, but every day I looked out of my window at the State Department, I never dreamed that a group of terrorists would be able to so completely affect the United States by destroying these buildings in New York, and now obviously by trying to attack Washington itself. It's certainly the worst terrorist incident in history, but I believe it's an attack not just on the United States. An attack on the World Trade Center is an attack on all the civilized countries of the world, and all the civilized countries of the world should see it that way.
Was this a scenario, a terrorist scenario, beyond anything that had been planned for?
Well, I don't think that this is beyond imagining. I think it's certainly beyond what anyone expected. We had seen the World Trade Center attacked before. An attempt was made to blow it up. So we knew that at the time there were discussions when certain of these terrorists were brought in for indictment that they had tried to take over a number of aircraft and conduct spectacular raids. So I don't think it was beyond the imagining, but I don't recall this particular scenario being discussed as one we had expected.
I wonder if you can put yourself back, cast your mind back to when you were in office. How do you think your colleagues who are still working there are actually feeling? What are they going through, do you think?
Well, government in a crisis is an extremely stressful enterprise, even without the kind of threat to the United States directly. I remember very stressful moments when the United States was in conflict in Kosovo, for example, but that pales in comparison when you know that somebody, your family members or friends or colleagues might well have been in those buildings in New York, and to watch them collapse before your very eyes on the television set really brings home the power of terrorists to damage the lives of free peoples. And we are a free people, and it's because we're a free people that terrorists can operate. It's not a closed society, and it's one of the privileges but also the pains of being a free people, as all of your viewers here in London know from the period of terrorism here in London.
James Rubin, stay with us for a moment. I'd like now to move to General Sir Michael Rose. Sir Michael, you only know in a sense what we know. I mean, we have this overview of what's happened, but we don't have the intimate detail, but I think we've got a pretty good idea of what's happened. What's your kind of military assessment of what has actually happened?
Well, I think in a way we need to go forward, and although inevitably there will be analysis of how these attacks happened and what we could do to stop them happening again in the same way, I think we need, once the natural feelings of horror and revulsion at these terrible events today have passed by, we need to step back and look at the long-term strategic consequences of these events, because what is certain is that the world will not be the same place again in the future. And I think we need to take a considered view about how we're going to respond. I think striking out with cruise missiles at suspected targets around the world is the last thing we should be doing at the moment.
Well, no, I mean, what we seem to know is that this was a coordinated attack by at least 4 hijacked airliners. The very fact that an airliner can be hijacked, can be driven at a target, that the captain can be made to do it, although our sense is that perhaps in Pennsylvania the pilot may have crashed the plane deliberately to prevent taking it into Washington, a great act of heroism perhaps, we don't know. But surely this is displaying a level of sophistication that even you must have doubted existed within the terrorist fold.
Well, I think it is a surprise that a group of people were able to achieve these terrifying events, which do have long-term strategic consequences, without any advanced knowledge amongst intelligence communities around the world. Also, questions are going to have to be asked as to how the weapons were got on board these aircraft, because my view is that the pilots didn't fly into these buildings with guns held to their heads. They were probably killed, and the suicidal terrorists then took over the controls and flew them in. And as you say, it didn't work in one case. But there's a whole lot of immediate questions that need to be asked. But standing back a bit, I think the strategic imperatives are altered dramatically. I think, first of all, defence organisations around the world need to reassess their priorities. Since the end of the Cold War, we've been embarked on a whole series of very honourable peacekeeping operations, humanitarian intervention operations, and only a lip service has been paid to the threat of weapons of mass destruction being used by terrorists, or as we see here, normal items that are available to everybody in a day-to-day life, modern society, being used to destroy the centre of the commercial centre of the world.
Well, what does that mean in practice? Because, I mean, actually getting into the mind of a terrorist and devising mechanisms to stall him or her is a very tall order, and one which has defeated many people before us.
Well, of course, there's no such thing as total security, but I think we can do a whole lot better than we've been doing in the past. As I said, I think only lip service has been paid in the past. I think we should be investing a considerable, greater effort in gathering intelligence, both human and technical. I think we can put in place a lot of technical devices, better ones, to prevent these sorts of incidents happening, because it'll be more difficult for terrorists to get their weapons onto airplanes, etc.
What about the missile defence shield? That comes into play in this?
Well, I think the missile defence shield's got absolutely nothing to do with any of this. I think it's taken the eye off what is, as Prime Minister Tony Blair said, the modern evil of terrorism, mass terrorism. And I think he needs to focus his mind on that. He needs to put the resources into his own defence and foreign policies, which will produce better responses than we've had hitherto. And I know that democratic countries, freedom of movement, the globalisation of world markets, all these things make it terribly easy for the terrorists to do this.
Right.
But we must address the problem.
Well, stay with us too, please. Let me just turn now to Professor Paul Rogers, and your business is more peace than war, and I'm wondering whether, from your perspective, looking at peace studies, I mean, how on earth does the world gird its loins against this kind of action?
I think with terrible difficulty. There was an assumption when the Cold War ended that we would move into a more stable, more peaceful world. Instead, over the last 10 or 12 years, if anything, there has been greater instability and more violence, particularly in many parts of the Middle East. There has also been an assumption that very powerful military states, the Western liberal democracies, could defend themselves and could maintain order. And what we've seen today with these terrible pictures from the United States is that there is something terribly wrong with that analysis, and we don't seem to have a real handle on the real way the world is going.
So, I mean, in practical terms, where do you see the great change of emphasis coming, and how is it manifest?
I think one of the things we have to recognize, and it's terribly difficult to say it at a time like this, is that there is bitter anti-Western feeling in many parts of the world, especially in the Middle East. We can, of course, condemn this terrible atrocity, this series of atrocities today, but if, as I think Sir Michael said, we respond just in a kind of blind retaliation, we're not even beginning to get an idea of what is actually happening in the world and the way the divisions are actually deepening. It's not the time to be talking this way in many ways because we have so many people who've died and so much suffering. But the worst thing that could happen would be for a kind of increase in the polarization consequent on this terrible disaster. We have to stand back and try and work out what are the root causes of the motivations of such people and what are the environments from which they come. If we don't do that, the net effect will be more of this kind of disaster in the future.
James Rubin, when your President Clinton was in the White House, Sudan was bombed for a much lesser violation than this. What does President Bush do? What do we think he'll do?
Well, obviously, I would be speculating. Let's assume that Osama bin Laden, who is the prime candidate, whose supporters and other groups have been talking about these kind of spectacular attacks on the United States for some time. Let's assume he was responsible. I don't accept the idea that the answer to that is to change our policy on the Middle East, as your previous guest suggested. The answer to that is that these are evil men. These are people who have put to death tens of thousands, perhaps, of innocent civilians from all over the world who might have been in the World Trade Center. And those evil people need to be rooted out directly. And military force should not be ruled out. And just because the cruise missile attacks in the past weren't successful in deterring a second attack, I think we have to be very, very clear that this is an attack on the United States of massive proportions, and the idea that the United States is not going to respond, find out who is responsible, bring them to justice, or destroy them is not serious.
But very briefly, what about attending to the discomfort and the distress of the people behind whose skirts these terrorists hide? Surely there has to be a greater engagement. If anything, surely since Bill Clinton left the White House, there has been a lesser engagement.
Well, I don't think this is a time for me to be criticizing my president, but I will say this. There are plenty of things we can do in the Middle East to improve the situation, but at the height of the peace process, when President Clinton was shepherding the Prime Minister of Israel and the Chairman Arafat towards a permanent peace, Al-Qaeda, the organization of Osama bin Laden, was still operating, even when the Palestinian people were 80% against suicide bombers because the peace process was bearing fruit. The Al-Qaeda organization of Osama bin Laden was operating and trying to conduct these kind of organizations. So changing our foreign policy to make it more palatable to some in the Middle East is not going to change the minds of these madmen.
James Rubin, thank you very much indeed. General Sir Michael Rose, thank you too. And Professor, if you would stay with us, please, we'll be looking a little later at who really may have perpetrated this atrocity. Well, we just got further pictures of the scene now in Pennsylvania. The plane which crashed about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. One local politician said it was apparently intended to hit Camp David, which is the presidential retreat in the state of Maryland. The plane was the United Airlines Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco with 38 people on board. We'll be giving you an emergency phone number at the Foreign Office later in the programme for relatives to contact them in case there's any anxiety about people in New York, Pennsylvania or anywhere else. You're watching Channel 4 News tonight, dominated by the terrifying attack on the United States. It began first thing this morning when a hijacked passenger jet smashed into one of the twin trade towers in New York. As smoke billowed into the skies, another plane was flown directly into the 110-story tower. As office workers ran for their lives, the South Tower collapsed, and then the North Tower, sending debris and rubble showering over the whole of Lower Manhattan. The number of casualties is still completely unknown. In the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., yet another hijacked plane slammed into the Pentagon, home of the Department of Defense, the heart of America's military power. Tonight, as President Bush vowed to hunt down those responsible, the entire country in shock. All international flights are grounded, land borders are sealed, and major buildings across the country stand empty. So what went wrong with America's airport security that allowed 4 planes to be seized from across the United States? Julian Rush looks now at how an attack on the heart of American finance, politics and military power could have been carried out.
Even as America reels, the questions begin. The terrorists' targets were well chosen. The Twin Towers, symbols of the American dream, of America's wealth and economic global domination. Symbols, it turns out, that were uniquely vulnerable. Remember, each tower is 110 floors, maximum population a staggering 50,000 people. What were the evacuation plans for so many? Just how do you fight a fire 400 meters above the street? And no skyscraper was ever designed to withstand this. The combination of the impact of tons of plane and the explosion of the fuel aboard, a fatal blow to the concrete and steel structures. Impossible, say engineers, to design a building to survive that.
Well, what's interesting is that the building withstood the plane impact, but it's a subsequent fire. The fuel would have poured through the building and ignited, and as you've seen in the film, set fire to the building. And as that fire took hold, the steel structures of the buildings got hot. They softened as they got hot, and the building just basically couldn't support the weight of the floors above it, and they just then collapsed down, and the whole building, unfolded, as you see in the pictures, like a pack of cards, just collapsing in a surreal way.
And it seems it was all too easy for the hijackers to get on board. The hijacks were all internal flights and chosen with precision timing. American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston for Los Angeles with 92 on board, the Boeing 767, had been due to take off at 7:45. 15 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 took off, again from Boston for Los Angeles, again a 767 carrying 65 people. At the same time, in Newark, near New York, United Airlines Flight 93, a Boeing 757 to San Francisco, took off with 45 on board. This is the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. And then at 8:10, American Airlines Flight 77 from Washington to LA, that took off with 64 on board. For internal air travel in America, it's just like catching a bus. Security checks are very few.
There's been concern for some time that civil aviation in the US is insecure. It's not possible to check all passengers on flight. It's not possible to close all airspace over sensitive areas. So there certainly have been advocates in the US security community saying that this is a disaster waiting to happen because US domestic airlines are so easy to hijack. And unfortunately, they may well now have been proved right.
Then there's the intelligence failings. Why did no one know? The USA has the world's biggest intelligence operation. It spends billions on high and low-tech surveillance. These attacks give the overwhelming impression of precision planning. They're already being compared to Pearl Harbor, a wake-up call before a war. But against whom? And to strike at the heart of America's military might. The Pentagon is one of the world's most secure buildings, but it seems desperately vulnerable from the air. George Bush thought attacks from rogue states would come from missiles. Son of Star Wars is impotent against hijacked commercial jets.
The US has stopped various attacks like this in the past. There's several times they've stopped audacious attempts like this at the last minute or through intelligence operations or indeed through preemptive arrests or preemptive strikes. But the point is with terrorism, as the IRA once said, terrorists only need to be lucky once. The security forces need to be lucky 100 times.
And what if, like the Oklahoma City bomb, it turns out to be the work of maverick militias and not connected to the Middle East at all? America was convulsed by introspective self-examination when Timothy McVeigh planted his bomb. It's a scenario American citizens must surely find too awful to contemplate.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning, and I assure you freedom will be defended. So declared President Bush. But can he track down those who carried it out? Our foreign affairs correspondent Gabby Rado looks now at the build-up to the assault and questions who might be behind such horrendous events.
The World Trade Center was the target of a previous attack in 1993. It was a bomb on that occasion planted in the car park underneath the towers, and 6 people were killed. The investigation which followed led to a group led by a blind Islamic militant called Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, who was later jailed for life. A document found in the Sheikh's apartment linked him to the man who then became America's public enemy #1, Osama bin Laden. Only 3 weeks ago, bin Laden warned from his hiding place in Afghanistan that there'd be an unprecedented attack on America and its interests.
To be able to take out the US World Trade Center and the Pentagon is almost a gesture or an operation, or twin operations, which demonstrate, in a sense, the wrath of God. It's apocalyptic in its ability to demonstrate Islamist power to fight America.
Though the Taliban regime in Afghanistan this afternoon denied that bin Laden was involved, the US embassy bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam 3 years ago have been the only recent example of coordinated, virtually simultaneous acts of terrorism. The combined death toll's 264. Tragically, that figure is likely to be dwarfed by today's catastrophic events. On a previous occasion, the US hit back hard, bombing targets in Afghanistan and Sudan linked with bin Laden.
Osama bin Laden has demonstrated the ability to launch 2 attacks simultaneously across vast distances through third countries, involving a number of different technicians, some trained in bombs, some trained in transportation, others capable of doing surveillance over an extended period of time, and to be able to deliver those bombs using very simple, primitive means right into the heart of embassies. He's demonstrated that.
Among Palestinians, there was a certain amount of celebration at the attacks, though it's not clear the full horror of the likely death toll was understood. There was an apparent claim from the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine that they were behind the atrocities, but it was later denied. The mainstream Palestinian leadership offered condolences.
We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
5 hours after the cataclysm and no evidence of who caused it. It's premature to blame Osama bin Laden with any certainty. Anyway, he's never admitted responsibility for any acts of terrorism. And at this early stage, it's probably unwise to assume without question that the perpetrators are a group connected with the Middle East.